A freezing little girl knocked on the window of a millionaire's car and whispered, "Mister, can I just sit inside? It's warm there," and what happened next changed both of their lives forever. The city was drowning in winter silence that night. Snowflakes danced beneath the pale glow of streetlights, settling in uneven layers on empty benches and parked cars. The world seemed still, untouched, except for the sharp whistling wind that scraped against the metal walls of a towering glass business center. The air smelled of frost and exhaust, and through it moved people who were all in a hurry to escape the cold. None of them noticed the tiny figure sitting on the edge of the parking lot, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around a small, ragged doll. The little girl couldn't have been older than 5, her blonde hair tangled and her blue eyes red from crying. She was wearing a thin white dress that barely reached her knees, her bare legs shivering against the concrete ground. Each breath came out in trembling clouds as she whispered softly to the doll, as if trying to comfort it. "It's okay, Lily. Just a little longer," she said, her voice cracking from the cold. Her lips were turning purple, her small hands stiff, and yet she didn't cry anymore. She had cried all her tears already. People had walked by earlier, glanced at her with confusion or pity, but no one stopped. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking for money. She was simply there, a ghost of innocence in a world too busy to care. Across the parking lot, the automatic doors of the business tower slid open with a soft hiss, and a tall man stepped out. His presence seemed to pull warmth out of the air. He was dressed in a light blue suit that contrasted sharply against the white snow. His shoes shone, and his dark hair was neatly styled. Everything about him radiated control, wealth, and discipline. His name was Aaron Wallace, a man known for his relentless ambition and emotional distance. He had built his company from the ground up, but with every success, he had lost something: his time, his smile, and eventually, his family. He was the kind of man who didn't stop for anyone, not even himself. Aaron unlocked his luxury car with a soft beep, intending to drive home to an empty apartment, the same one he had lived in since his wife and daughter had died 3 years earlier. But as he opened the door, a quiet voice came from behind him, fragile and hesitant, almost lost to the wind. "Mister, can I sit in your car? It's warm." He froze. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, a remnant of a dream, maybe the echo of a memory that refused to die. But then he turned, and there she was, the little girl in the white dress, standing just a few feet away, her small hands shaking, her doll pressed tightly against her chest. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her eyes were so impossibly blue that for an instant, he felt like he was looking into the past. Aaron's throat tightened. His instinct was to walk away. He didn't know how to talk to children anymore. He didn't know how to deal with feelings that could reopen wounds he tried to bury under years of work. But something in the girl's expression, that mix of fear, exhaustion, and quiet courage, stopped him. "Where are your parents?" he asked softly, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. She hesitated, then whispered, "Mama's sleeping, and Daddy didn't come back." Her voice was small, almost mechanical, as if she'd repeated that line to herself too many times to make it hurt less. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The world around them faded, the honking cars, the distant chatter, the wind. There was only her trembling figure and his heartbeat echoing somewhere deep inside. Then, without another word, Aaron reached into his coat pocket, pressed the button on his key fob, and the car lights blinked softly. "Come on," he said finally. The girl's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at the car, then at him, unsure if this was a trick or a miracle. When he nodded, she shuffled forward slowly, her small boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. She let out a tiny gasp and climbed onto the seat, clutching her doll to her chest. The heater hummed quietly, filling the space with comfort and the faint smell of leather and cologne. She stared out the window, watching snowflakes slide down the glass, and whispered, "It's so warm." Aaron sat in silence beside her, his hands resting on the steering wheel, though he made no move to start the car. He just watched her reflection in the glass, her messy hair, her trembling lips, the way her fingers slowly relaxed as the warmth reached her. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, what her name was, where she lived, how long she had been outside, but the words felt heavy. Instead, he simply said, "You can stay here for a while." She nodded without looking at him, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, mister." There was a pause, and then she added, almost as if to herself, "You smell like my dad." Aaron looked away, his chest tightening. It had been years since anyone had mentioned that word to him. In the quiet hum of the car, surrounded by the falling snow, something began to thaw inside him, something he didn't understand yet, but that felt frighteningly alive. Outside, the city continued to move, cold and indifferent. But inside that car, on a freezing winter night, a man who thought he had lost everything and a girl who had nothing found warmth, not just in the air, but in the faint spark of something that might one day become family again. Aaron sat behind the wheel for a long time, unsure of what to do next. The heater hummed quietly, and the rhythmic tapping of snow against the windshield filled the silence. The little girl, who sat curled up in the passenger seat, was still holding her doll tightly. Her tiny fingers played absently with the frayed ribbon around the doll's neck as if that small act helped her stay calm. Every few minutes she looked toward the window, then back at him, as though afraid that if she spoke too loudly, he might ask her to leave. Aaron glanced at her again, trying to imagine how a child could end up here alone on a night like this. He wanted to believe that her mother would suddenly appear out of the dark, apologize for the misunderstanding, and take her home. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Her face told a story that no 5-year-old should have to live through. He cleared his throat softly and asked her name. She hesitated, staring down at her hands before answering in a small voice, "Lila." He repeated it quietly, almost to himself, feeling the name linger in the air. "That's a pretty name," he said. She looked at him cautiously and, for the first time, a faint smile flickered on her lips. "Mama picked it," she whispered. The words hit him in the chest with quiet force. He thought about how long she must have been outside, how cold her hands were even now, and how long she had gone without food. Without another word, he reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a chocolate bar he'd bought that morning but forgotten about, and handed it to her. She stared at it like it was treasure, then looked up at him uncertainly. "You can have it," he said. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore open the wrapper, and when she took the first bite, her eyes closed as if savoring the warmth that the sweetness gave her. Aaron leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to this feeling, the urge to protect someone, to take responsibility for something fragile. For years, he had avoided any situation that could make him feel this kind of vulnerability again. After losing his wife and daughter, he had locked that part of himself away, convincing himself that caring only led to pain. But watching Lila sitting there, eating chocolate with such quiet gratitude, he felt that wall inside him start to crack. He asked softly, "Where did you come from, Lila?" She chewed for a moment before answering. "We had a house once," she said. "But Mama got sick, and then, we didn't." Her voice broke a little at the end, and she turned her head away quickly, pretending to focus on the doll in her lap. Aaron didn't push her for more details. The way she said it was enough. He reached into his coat pocket, found his phone, and searched for nearby shelters. There were a few within a few miles, though most would have closed their intake for the night. He debated calling someone from social services, but the thought of leaving her with strangers in a cold, impersonal place made his stomach turn. She didn't deserve another empty room, another door closed on her. He glanced at her again and noticed that her eyelids were growing heavy. The exhaustion in her small body was overwhelming. "You can sleep if you want," he said quietly. "You're safe here." She nodded without speaking, curling up on the seat, her doll pressed against her cheek. Within minutes, her breathing evened out, soft and steady. Erin sat there watching her sleep, the dim light from the dashboard painting her face in soft hues of gold and blue. Something about her reminded him painfully of his own daughter, the way her lashes rested against her skin, the way she clutched her doll as if it were the only thing in the world keeping her safe. He closed his eyes, and memories he'd fought to forget began to surface. The sound of laughter echoing in a kitchen. The smell of pancakes on a Sunday morning. A small voice calling him "Daddy." Then the silence that followed the accident. The police officer's voice. The way everything inside him had gone cold that night and never warmed again. He opened his eyes and looked at Lila once more, feeling the weight of that same loss pressing against him, but this time, mixed with something new, a need to make sure that no one else had to feel it. He didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he turned off the engine to conserve fuel, leaving the heater running just enough to keep her warm. The world outside the car continued in motion, headlights gliding past, snow drifting lazily from the sky, but inside, time seemed to have stopped. Aaron rested his head back and stared at the ceiling, wondering when his life had become so empty that he hadn't noticed the loneliness anymore. For years, he had measured his success by the size of his office, the numbers on his bank account, the power of his name. And yet, at that moment, sitting in silence beside a sleeping child who had nothing, he felt more human than he had in years. As the hours passed, he found himself whispering softly, "You're safe now, kid." He didn't even realize he'd said it out loud. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, and that small motion, that unconscious trust, settled deep in his chest. When dawn began to lighten the horizon, painting the snow in faint shades of pink and gold, Aaron made a decision. He didn't know how he was going to do it or what the right steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to leave her out here again. Whatever it took, he would make sure she never had to ask a stranger for warmth ever again. When the first light of morning crept across the skyline, Aaron's car was still parked in the same spot, its windows fogged with condensation from the steady warmth inside. He blinked against the pale sunlight, his neck stiff from sitting all night in the same position. Lila was still asleep, her tiny body curled up in the seat, her doll resting beneath her chin. The sight of her sleeping so peacefully in a place that should have been cold and impersonal tugged at something deep inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to check his phone or glance at his calendar. Instead, he sat quietly, just listening to the faint rhythm of her breathing and the muted hum of the city coming to life outside. He realized that he didn't want this moment to end, because once it did, he would have to face the question that had been haunting him since the night before: what was he supposed to do with her now? He gently reached forward and adjusted the heater so that the air wasn't blowing directly on her face. She stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent, before her blue eyes blinked open. For a second, confusion flickered across her face, then recognition. "You're still here," she said quietly, her voice rough from sleep. Aaron gave a small nod. "Of course I am," he replied. She smiled faintly, and it was the kind of smile that was both fragile and powerful, the kind that made him feel an ache he couldn't quite name. He asked if she was hungry, and she nodded. Her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to admit that. Without another word, he started the car and drove toward a nearby diner. Inside, the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. The waitress looked at Lila with curiosity but didn't ask questions. They took a booth near the window, and Aaron ordered pancakes, eggs, and hot chocolate. Lila watched him the entire time, her eyes wide and cautious, as if trying to decide whether or not he was real. When the food arrived, she hesitated again, glancing at him for permission before taking a bite. "You don't have to ask," he said softly. "Eat as much as you want." That was all she needed to hear. She devoured the food with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Between bites, she kept talking to her doll, telling it to eat too, whispering little stories as if the doll could understand. Aaron tried not to stare, but every gesture she made drew his attention. He had seen children like her before, in photos, in charity reports, in fleeting moments while driving past shelters on his way to meetings. But this was different. This wasn't some abstract idea of poverty or loss, it was right here in front of him, with a name and a heartbeat and a pair of blue eyes that seemed too big for her face. He wondered how many people had walked past her before he stopped. The thought made his stomach turn. When they finished breakfast, Lila leaned back against the seat, looking more alive than she had the night before. "Thank you, mister," she said, her voice soft but full of sincerity. "My mom used to make pancakes like this. But hers were always a little burnt." She giggled quietly, and Aaron found himself smiling too. "Burnt pancakes sound perfect," he said. "They were," she replied, and for a brief moment, her expression shifted, sadness creeping into her voice. She looked down at her doll and whispered, "I hope she's not cold." Aaron didn't know how to answer that, so he simply reached across the table and said, "I'm sure she'd want you to be warm and safe." After breakfast, he drove her to a nearby shelter. He told himself it was the responsible thing to do, that professionals would know how to care for her better than he could. But when they arrived, the building's gray walls and the tired faces of the staff made him hesitate. Lila clung to her doll and looked up at him with wide eyes. "Do I have to stay here?" she asked. He crouched down so they were eye level, and for a moment, he couldn't find the right words. "Just for a little while," he finally said, forcing a reassuring tone. "They'll take care of you here." The woman at the desk took down his information and thanked him for bringing the child in. But as he turned to leave, he heard Lila call out softly, "Mister." He turned back, and she was standing there, holding her doll tightly. "Will I see you again?" The question froze him. He wanted to tell her yes, but he also knew that would mean opening a door he wasn't sure he could handle. "We'll see," he said, his voice almost breaking. She nodded, trying to smile, though her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Driving away from the shelter felt like driving away from something more than just a child, it felt like abandoning a piece of himself he didn't realize he still had. The silence in the car was unbearable. He turned on the radio to drown out his thoughts, but every song seemed too hollow. He kept seeing her reflection in the rearview mirror, the way she had looked at him as if he was the only safe thing in her world. He told himself it was for the best. He wasn't fit to take care of a child, not again. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe he had just made the same mistake twice, walking away when someone needed him most. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of Lila sitting in that shelter wouldn't leave his mind. He imagined her lying on a cot surrounded by strangers, clutching her doll, wondering if he had meant what he said. For years, Aaron had lived a life dictated by logic and control, but nothing about this situation felt logical anymore. As he stared at the ceiling in the dark, one thought kept repeating itself, quiet but relentless: what if she doesn't make it through another night alone? And before the sun rose again, Aaron knew exactly what he was going to do. Aaron couldn't shake the image of Lila from his mind. No matter how much he tried to distract himself with meetings, reports, and phone calls, her small face kept flashing before his eyes, the uncertain way she smiled, the way her fingers clung to her doll as though it were her last connection to the world she had lost. By afternoon, he had given up any pretense of work. The words on the documents in front of him blurred together, meaningless. He sat at his desk, staring out at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching snow drift lazily across the glass. The city looked distant and hollow, much like the life he had built for himself. He had thought success would fill the silence, that wealth could build walls high enough to keep the ghosts out. But now, that silence was deafening, and all he could hear was the echo of a child's voice asking softly, "Will I see you again?" By evening, he couldn't stand it any longer. He grabbed his coat, ignoring the questioning looks from his assistant, and left the building without saying where he was going. The drive to the shelter was short but felt endless. The streets were coated in slush, and the setting sun painted the city in tones of gray and orange. When he arrived, he sat in his car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, arguing silently with himself. What was he doing? Why couldn't he just let it go? But something deep inside refused to listen to reason. He had walked away from too much already, and this time, he wasn't going to do it again. When he entered the shelter, the woman at the desk recognized him immediately. She gave him a polite but tired smile. "You're back," she said. "Is everything all right?" Aaron hesitated, then said, "The little girl I brought yesterday, Lila. I just wanted to check on her." The woman's expression softened, though there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "She's in the common room," she said quietly. "But it's been difficult. She's not talking much. Hardly ate today." Aaron felt a tightness in his chest as he thanked her and walked down the dimly lit hallway. The common room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air. The walls were covered with faded posters about kindness and hope, but the children inside seemed too tired to believe in either. Some sat at a table playing with old toys, others stared blankly at the small television in the corner. And then he saw her, sitting by the window, knees pulled to her chest, her doll resting limply in her lap. Her hair was tangled, and her small shoulders looked even thinner in the oversized sweater someone had given her. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her thoughts, tracing invisible patterns on the glass as she watched snow fall outside. Aaron stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Then, quietly, he spoke. "Hey, Lila." She turned, and when her eyes met his, they widened in disbelief. "You came back," she whispered. He nodded, taking a slow step closer. "I told you we'd see," he said softly. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to be sure he was real. Then, in an instant, she jumped up from the chair and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. The sudden warmth of her small body against him caught him off guard. He froze, then slowly placed a hand on her back, feeling her trembling slightly. "I missed you," she said into his coat. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. "I missed you too," he admitted quietly, the word surprising even himself. After a few moments, she pulled back and looked up at him. "Can we go now?" she asked, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. He hesitated, glancing at the staff members who were watching from across the room. "Let's talk to them first," he said. Together, they approached the woman from before. Aaron explained that he wanted to take responsibility for Lila, at least temporarily. The woman's expression was kind but cautious. "Mr. Wallace, it's not that simple," she said. "There are procedures. Legalities. You can't just take her with you." He understood, but something in his voice when he replied made her pause. "Then tell me what I have to do," he said. "Whatever it takes." Over the next hour, they went through paperwork, background checks, and questions that dug deeper into his personal life than he was comfortable with. He answered them all. He didn't care how long it took. Lila sat quietly beside him, holding her doll, occasionally glancing up at him as though afraid he might change his mind. When the last form was signed, the woman smiled gently. You can take her for now, she said. But there will be follow-ups, home visits, evaluations. He nodded quickly. I understand. When they stepped back outside, the cold evening air bit at their faces, but neither of them cared. Lila held his hand tightly as they walked to the car, her small fingers gripping his like she was afraid he might disappear. Once inside, she turned to him and whispered, "Are we going home?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. His apartment had never felt like a home, just walls and furniture, expensive things meant to distract him from the emptiness inside. But looking at her now, he realized that maybe it could be. Yes, he said finally. We're going home. That night, as they drove through the quiet city streets, the world outside seemed softer somehow. The snow reflected the streetlights in shimmering waves, and Lila's head slowly drooped against the window, her eyes fluttering shut. Aaron glanced at her reflection in the glass, peaceful, trusting, fragile, and something inside him shifted. For years, he had lived without purpose beyond profit, without warmth beyond the glow of his office lights. But now, sitting beside this little girl who had asked only for warmth, he felt something stir that he thought was long dead. It wasn't just pity or obligation. It was the faint, unfamiliar pulse of belonging. And as the car disappeared into the snow-covered night, he knew, perhaps for the first time, that his life was about to change forever. When they arrived at Aaron's apartment, the night had already wrapped the city in silence, broken only by the faint hum of traffic far below. The building's glass exterior reflected the lights of downtown, a symbol of wealth and success that had always made him feel safe. Now it only felt cold. As the elevator doors opened, Lila hesitated at the threshold. Her small hand gripped his tightly, her wide blue eyes darting around the sleek lobby, the marble floors polished to perfection, the air heavy with a quiet that felt too sterile to breathe in. "It's okay," Aaron said softly, guiding her inside. "You're safe here." She nodded but didn't speak, her gaze fixed on the reflection of their figures in the mirrored walls. To her, this must have felt like stepping into another world, one where everything was too clean, too bright, too distant from the streets and shelters she had known. When the elevator reached the top floor, Aaron led her into his penthouse. The automatic lights flicked on, illuminating a space that looked more like a showroom than a home. The furniture was immaculate, untouched, and there wasn't a single trace of warmth, no photos, no clutter, no color. Lila stopped near the doorway and whispered, "It's really big." He smiled faintly, trying to see the space through her eyes. "Yeah, I guess it is." She walked further in, her small shoes squeaking softly against the floor, and stared at the view outside the enormous window, a sweeping panorama of the city below, shimmering under the snow. "Do you live here alone?" she asked after a moment. He nodded, though saying it out loud felt heavier than he expected. "Yes, just me." She looked around again, her voice barely audible when she said, "It feels lonely." Her words hit him harder than he anticipated. He opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the right thing to say. Instead, he walked to the kitchen and asked if she wanted something warm to drink. "Hot chocolate," he suggested. Her face lit up slightly, and she nodded. As he poured the milk and stirred the cocoa, he couldn't help but think how strange this felt, a man who hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years now making hot chocolate for a little girl he'd met 2 days ago. But the simplicity of the act soothed something in him. When he brought the mug to her, she wrapped her hands around it carefully, savoring the warmth as if it were the most precious thing she'd ever held. After she finished, he showed her the guest room, a small, quiet space with a neatly made bed and a soft lamp. She walked in slowly, touching the blankets as though unsure if she was allowed to. "You can stay here as long as you need," Aaron said. She turned to him, her eyes glistening in the light. "Really?" He nodded. "Really." She climbed onto the bed and hugged her doll tightly. "Thank you, mister," she said in a sleepy voice. "Good night." He stood in the doorway for a long moment after she closed her eyes, watching her chest rise and fall in the soft rhythm of sleep. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the silence in his apartment. It felt different now, filled with something tender and fragile. Aaron didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room, staring at the city lights, his mind restless. Questions he didn't have answers to swirled through his thoughts. How could he take care of her properly? What would happen when the authorities came? Whether he was even capable of giving her the kind of life she deserved. Yet beneath all those doubts, there was one feeling that anchored him: he couldn't send her away again. He thought of how small she had looked sitting on that shelter cot, how tightly she had clung to him when he came back for her, and he realized that she had already become part of something he hadn't even known was missing. In the early morning, he heard the sound of footsteps. Lila appeared in the doorway, still in her oversized sweater, her hair messy from sleep. "You're awake," he said, surprised. She nodded shyly. "I had a dream," she whispered. "I dreamed Mama came back, and she was smiling." She said thank you. The innocence in her voice twisted something inside him. He didn't know what to say, so he just motioned for her to come sit beside him. She climbed onto the couch, tucking her knees under her chin. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun rise over the city. "Do you work here?" she asked after a few minutes. "Sort of," he said with a small laugh. "I run a company downtown." She thought about that for a moment, then said, "So you're the boss?" He nodded. "Something like that." She tilted her head. "That sounds lonely too." Her words were so honest that he couldn't help but smile sadly. "It can be," he admitted. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." She leaned against his side, her head resting on his arm, and he froze at first. The gesture was so natural, so trusting. Then he let out a quiet breath and rested his hand gently on her shoulder. In that small, simple moment, the distance between their worlds seemed to fade. Over the next few days, they fell into an easy rhythm. He took time off work, something he hadn't done in years, to make sure she was settled. They cooked breakfast together, or rather, she stirred pancake batter and spilled flour everywhere while he pretended not to notice. She drew pictures on his office papers and asked endless questions about everything she saw. And for the first time since losing his family, Aaron laughed, genuinely laughed, until his chest ached. But beneath the laughter, he knew reality was still waiting. There would be questions from child services, explanations he couldn't avoid. Yet every time he looked at Lila's small frame sitting by the window, coloring with quiet concentration, he couldn't bring himself to imagine a future without her in it. She had walked into his life by accident, but it no longer felt like chance. It felt like something that was always meant to happen, something that had found him when he had stopped believing in second chances. As the snow continued to fall outside, soft and endless, Aaron realized that maybe this wasn't just about saving her, maybe she was saving him too. The days began to blend together in a quiet rhythm that neither of them wanted to break. For the first time in years, Aaron found himself waking up not to the sound of his alarm or the ping of an email but to the faint rustling of small footsteps padding through the hallway. Lila had a habit of waking early, tiptoeing into the kitchen to help him make breakfast, which usually meant spilling flour or cracking eggs onto the counter with intense concentration. He didn't mind. Every mess she made seemed to breathe new life into the stillness of his home. Her laughter, soft and unguarded, echoed in the walls that had once felt suffocating. Sometimes he would just stand there, leaning against the counter, watching her hum to herself as she stirred pancake batter or tried to arrange fruit into a smiley face on her plate. It was such an ordinary thing, yet it felt extraordinary to him. Lila began to fill his apartment with small pieces of color and sound. She drew pictures and taped them to the refrigerator. Some were of flowers, others of stick figures holding hands, one that looked suspiciously like him. She found an old plant in the corner of the living room that had long been forgotten and insisted on watering it every day, declaring it her friend. She played with her doll by the window, making up elaborate stories that often involved talking birds or magical cities in the clouds. Aaron would listen quietly from his study as her imagination turned silence into something alive. It amazed him how effortlessly she turned emptiness into warmth. At work, people began to notice the change in him. His assistant, Julia, asked if he was feeling all right, since he had started smiling for no apparent reason and had postponed several major meetings. He brushed it off, claiming he was simply taking some personal time. The truth was that he no longer felt the same urgency to prove himself, no longer measured his worth in profit or stock prices. His priorities had shifted in a way that frightened him and comforted him at once. Every hour away from Lila felt like a waste. He had started to understand something he hadn't even known he was missing, the feeling of being needed for something that couldn't be bought or sold. But even as the bond between them grew stronger, an uneasy tension lingered in the back of his mind. The shelter had warned him there would be follow-ups, visits from social workers to ensure Lila was safe and cared for. He knew it was only a matter of time before they called. One morning, as he was reading through some documents at the kitchen table, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was polite but formal, a woman from the Department of Family Services. She informed him that a representative would be visiting in a few days to evaluate Lila's living situation. He thanked her calmly, but after he hung up, a cold weight settled in his stomach. What if they didn't think he was fit to keep her? What if they took her away? The thought of losing her made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since his own family's accident years ago. That night, as he tucked Lila into bed, he sat beside her a little longer than usual. She looked up at him sleepily, clutching her doll. "Are you okay?" she asked. He forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart." She studied his face for a moment before whispering, "You don't look fine." Her honesty caught him off guard. He sighed and said, "I just worry sometimes. About things I can't control." She reached out, placing her small hand over his. "You don't have to worry. I'm here," she said softly, as if she were the one protecting him. He laughed quietly, though his eyes burned. "You're right," he said. "You are here." She smiled, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep while he sat there in the dim light, feeling the weight of both gratitude and fear pressing down on him. The next few days passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. He cleaned the apartment obsessively, not out of vanity but out of desperation to make everything perfect. He wanted the social worker to see what he saw, that Lila was safe, loved, and happy. On the morning of the visit, Lila wore her favorite yellow dress and proudly showed Aaron the flowers she had drawn for the lady who's coming to see us. When the doorbell finally rang, he felt his heartbeat quicken. A woman in her 40s stood there, professional but kind-eyed, holding a clipboard. She introduced herself as Ms. Rivera. Lila greeted her politely and even offered her the flower drawing, which made the woman smile. They sat in the living room while Ms. Rivera asked her questions. Lila answered honestly, her words simple but powerful. "He makes me pancakes," she said. "And he reads to me before bed. And he lets me draw on the fridge." Aaron listened, trying not to let emotion show on his face. Ms. Rivera nodded approvingly, jotting down notes. Then she turned to him, asking about his background, his work schedule, his reasons for taking Lila in. He spoke carefully, truthfully, explaining how he'd found her, how he couldn't walk away, how she had changed his life. At the end of the interview, Ms. Rivera closed her notebook and looked at them both. "You've done well, Mr. Wallace," she said. "She seems safe here. Happy. Relief flooded through him, so overwhelming that he could barely thank her. After the visit, Lila jumped into his arms. "Did we do good?" she asked. He laughed, holding her tight. "We did perfect." She looked up at him with that radiant, unguarded smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. For the rest of the day, they celebrated with hot chocolate and cartoons, her laughter filling every corner of the apartment. That night, after she fell asleep, Aaron stood by her door for a long time, watching her breathe softly in the glow of the nightlight. He realized how much she had changed him in such a short time, not by asking for anything, but simply by existing. She had reminded him how to feel, how to care, how to hope. And as he turned off the light and closed the door quietly behind him, he made a silent promise that no matter what it took, he would never let her go again. Winter began to fade slowly, though the cold still clung stubbornly to the edges of the city. Aaron found himself walking Lila to the small park near his building almost every afternoon. It had become their ritual. After he finished work, he would hold her hand as they crossed the busy streets, and she would skip beside him, telling him about everything she had seen or imagined that day. The world looked different with her beside him. The same streets that had once seemed lifeless now felt alive, full of colors and sounds he hadn't noticed in years. Watching her chase pigeons or laugh at her own clumsy snowballs was enough to make him forget the heaviness that used to define his days. But beneath the simplicity of those moments, something deeper had begun to stir, something that scared him more than anything. He was starting to realize that he couldn't imagine life without her. One afternoon, after they returned from the park, he received an unexpected call. It was Ms. Rivera again, the social worker. Her tone was polite but hesitant. She said there had been new information about Lila's situation. "A relative has come forward," she told him. Aaron froze. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Who?" he asked. "Her maternal aunt," Ms. Rivera explained. "She's been searching for Lila since her sister's passing. She recently moved back to the city and filed a request to take custody." The words hit him like a blow. He managed to thank her and end the call, but when he hung up, the apartment felt suddenly smaller, colder. The thought of Lila leaving made his chest ache in a way he didn't know how to process. That evening, as they ate dinner together, Lila noticed his silence. "You're sad," she said simply. He smiled faintly, trying to hide the truth. "Just tired," he replied. But she wasn't convinced. "You always look like that when you're thinking too much," she said, frowning. Her observation was so innocent yet so accurate that he almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, but how could he? How could he explain that someone might take her away, that the fragile peace they'd built could vanish because of paperwork and bloodlines? Instead, he just reached across the table and took her hand. "No matter what happens," he said quietly, "you're going to be okay." She nodded, though she didn't understand why he said it that way. The following week was one of the hardest in his life. The social services arranged a meeting with the aunt, whose name was Rachel. Aaron tried to prepare himself, but nothing could steady the anxiety twisting inside him. On the day of the meeting, he dressed carefully, though his reflection in the mirror looked unfamiliar, too vulnerable, too uncertain. Lila wore her yellow dress again, the one she had insisted was lucky. When Rachel arrived, Aaron was taken aback by how young she looked. She couldn't have been much older than 30, with tired eyes and the same blonde hair as Lila. There was an unmistakable resemblance between them that made his heart tighten. She greeted him kindly, but her attention immediately went to Lila, who stared back at her in confusion. "Lila," Ms. Rivera said gently, "this is your Aunt Rachel." Lila blinked. "My aunt?" she repeated. Rachel knelt down, her voice trembling. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your mom's sister." For a long moment, No one spoke. Then Lila took a small step forward. "You knew my mama?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "I loved her very much." The air in the room seemed to grow heavy with emotion. Aaron stood back, feeling like an intruder in a moment that didn't belong to him, yet his chest ached with something sharp and unspoken. They talked for nearly an hour. Rachel explained how she had been living abroad when her sister passed away, how it had taken months to find out what had happened, and even longer to locate Lila. She spoke with sincerity, and Aaron could see she truly wanted to do right by her niece. But every word she said made his stomach twist tighter. When the visit ended, Lila clung to his side, reluctant to let go of his hand. Rachel smiled gently. "It's okay, Lila," she said softly. "We'll get to know each other soon." But when Lila looked up at Aaron, her eyes were full of fear. "I don't want to go," she whispered. He crouched down beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out, okay? Nothing's decided yet." She nodded, but tears were already gathering in her eyes. That night, Aaron couldn't sleep. He paced the apartment, listening to the wind outside and the soft breathing from Lila's room. Every time he thought of her being taken away, a wave of helpless anger washed over him. He had done everything right, followed every rule, filled out every form, but none of it would matter if the law decided she belonged somewhere else. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it, just stood by the window staring at the city below. The skyline that had once inspired him now felt indifferent, towering and cold. What was the point of everything he had built if he couldn't protect the one person who finally made his life mean something? The next morning, Lila woke up earlier than usual and found him sitting in the living room, still dressed in yesterday's shirt. She climbed into his lap without saying a word and rested her head against his chest. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. "You were gone." His throat tightened, and he wrapped his arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, though deep down he feared it might not be true. She tilted her head up to look at him. "Promise?" she asked. He hesitated for only a second before answering, "Promise." The following days passed in a haze of uncertainty. There were more meetings, more documents, more waiting. Rachel visited again, bringing small gifts for Lila, a picture of her mother, a stuffed animal from their old home. Lila was polite, even curious, but each time Rachel left, she ran back to Aaron's side. One evening, after Rachel's visit, Lila looked up at him and asked quietly, "If I go with her, can I still see you?" The question nearly broke him. He swallowed hard before answering. "Yes," he said softly. "No matter what happens, you'll always see me." But when she went to bed, he stayed up long into the night, staring at the adoption papers he had begun filing weeks ago. They sat unfinished on his desk, mocking him with their incompleteness. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing had become clear: he would fight for her, not out of pity or guilt, but out of love. Somewhere along the way, this little girl had become his family. And as the snow fell quietly outside once more, Aaron realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing his fortune or his status, only her. The final decision came on a gray morning that felt heavier than any storm Aaron had ever weathered. The city outside his window was wrapped in fog, the kind that swallowed sound and made everything seem uncertain. He sat in the waiting room of the family court, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw tense. Lila sat beside him, her small legs swinging above the floor, clutching her worn-out doll against her chest. She was too young to understand the full weight of what was about to happen, but she could feel his tension. Every few seconds, she glanced up at him with wide, worried eyes, and he forced himself to smile, even though the muscles in his face resisted. Across the room, Rachel sat quietly with her lawyer, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was sadness in her eyes too, and Aaron could see that she wasn't his enemy, she simply wanted what she believed was right. That realization didn't make it hurt any less. When they were called into the hearing room, Aaron felt his pulse quicken. The space was small and sterile, the air filled with that familiar mix of paperwork and coffee. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, listened patiently as both sides presented their cases. Rachel spoke first, explaining her family connection, her desire to raise her sister's child, and her plans to provide stability and care. Aaron listened silently, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Then it was his turn. He stood, his voice steady but thick with emotion, and told them everything: the night he found Lila in the cold, the way she had changed his life, the laughter that had returned to his home because of her. He didn't embellish or beg, he simply spoke the truth. "She gave me a reason to live again," he said quietly. "And I think I gave her the same." When he finished, the room fell silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The judge didn't give her decision right away. She took time to review the case, to consider every detail, and the waiting was agonizing. Hours passed like days. Lila eventually fell asleep on his lap, her tiny hand resting on his. He stroked her hair gently, his mind replaying every moment they had shared, her first night in his home, her laughter in the park, the way she had looked at him when she said, "You don't look fine." Every memory felt like a knife and a bomb at the same time. When the judge finally returned, Aaron held his breath. She began by acknowledging the difficult nature of the case. "Mr. Wallace," she said, looking at him with an expression that was both stern and kind, "you have provided extraordinary care for this child under unexpected circumstances. Your commitment to her well-being is evident." Then she turned to Rachel. "Ms. Davis, you are her biological family, and it's clear your intentions come from love and duty." The room was completely silent as the judge paused, glancing between them. "In light of all the evidence," she continued, "and after consulting with Child Services, the court has decided that it is in Lila's best interest to remain under the guardianship of Mr. Aaron Wallace, with continued visitation and involvement from Ms. Davis." For a moment, Aaron didn't fully register what she had said. He blinked, trying to process the words. When they finally sank in, relief flooded through him so suddenly that he felt dizzy. Rachel's eyes glistened with tears, and she nodded slowly, clearly heartbroken but accepting. "Take care of her," she whispered as they left the room. "She deserves someone who truly sees her." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cold, but for the first time in months, Aaron felt like he could breathe again. He lifted Lila into his arms as she stirred awake. "Is it over?" she asked sleepily. "It's over," he said softly. "We can go home now." She smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering, "I knew you'd stay." Those words nearly undid him. He held her close as they walked toward the car, the weight of her small body against his chest grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. Rachel kept her promise to stay involved, visiting every few weeks, and though it had been awkward at first, the tension gradually eased. She and Aaron began to speak more openly, even finding comfort in sharing stories about Lila's mother. Lila, meanwhile, seemed to flourish. She started kindergarten, made friends easily, and brought home endless drawings that filled Aaron's office walls. Every evening, she would tell him stories about her day while he cooked dinner, and he found himself laughing at her wild imagination and the way she always managed to make even the simplest moments magical. One spring afternoon, they went to the park again. The air was warm, the trees bursting with new leaves, and the sound of children's laughter filled the space. Lila ran ahead, chasing bubbles that drifted in the sunlight. Aaron watched her with a mix of awe and gratitude. A few months ago, his life had been nothing but meetings and deadlines, his emotions buried under years of guilt and grief. Now, because of her, he had rediscovered what it meant to care, to feel joy without fear, to love without conditions. When she turned and waved at him, calling, "Come on, Daddy," he froze for a moment, stunned by the word. She said it so naturally, as if it had always belonged to him. He walked toward her slowly, then faster, laughing as she jumped into his arms. That night, after putting her to bed, he stood by the window, looking out at the city that glittered below. It no longer felt empty. The lights didn't seem distant anymore, they seemed alive, connected, part of something bigger. Lila's laughter still echoed faintly down the hall, and for the first time in years, Aaron realized he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would never let her feel alone again. In that moment, he finally understood what she had given him. She hadn't just needed warmth or safety, she had given him back his own humanity. And as the city settled into the quiet rhythm of night, he whispered into the stillness, "You saved me, kid." Somewhere down the hall, half asleep, Lila stirred and murmured softly, "I love you too." It was such a small sound, but to Aaron, it was everything. It was home.